There's something sacred about painting a horse, a creature of strength and grace, yet deeply gentle. Today isn't just about painting an animal, but about presence, the rhythm of breath, the energy in every mark. I'm exploring that spirit today using non-traditional tools and alkyd oils to let the painting find its own life. Let's get into it. So as promised, this week we are doing a painting with alkyd oil paints. They are kind of a bridge between oil paints and acrylics, which we kind of tested last couple weeks. All alkyd oil paints is basically traditional oil paint modified with a type of a synthetic resin binder called, as you may guess, an alkyd. So that resin replaces part of the natural oil like linseed or sawflower, which are traditional binders, which are usually found in regular oil paints. The result is a medium that dries, they say, much faster. So this is going to be part of our experiment. I'm hoping to do this portrait of this animal over a 2-day period. So this is supposed to be the key advantage over oil paints, and that allows you certain workability, but it dries much faster than traditional oils without, of course, losing the depth, luminosity, and handling qualities that artists love so much about oils. As I said, they're kind of a bridge between oils and acrylics, but you know, you've got the richness of one with the convenience of the other if you want. So I was recently gifted a set of alkyd oil paints from this company called Rubens or Paul Rubens Oils. I think it's a Chinese-based company. In fact, I didn't know that the colors themselves are going to be artist grade. What I will be doing is using these, because these are the only ones I've got for now, and I will grade them as best as I can. By the end of this video, hopefully you have a good idea of how alkyds perform and if this brand is worth your time. These are in fact the oils that I received. And this is an often occurrence where you got artist grade paint versus, student grade paint versus artist paints. Colors have a certain funky name to them, like opera light red or opera green. So I've already pre-mixed just some of the pools, and if this turns out okay and I post it and you're watching this, very likely you'll see a finished work somewhere here, and my reference photo, which I haven't used much on the channel here because everything I want to communicate here seems to rotate around that concept of creativity from the inside out and not from some outside sources based on intuition, whatever you want to call it. But we will be using a photo. I received it or I downloaded it from one of these photo sharing sites, and I will put a link down below. But for reference, I will also put the portrait of this beautiful animal. By the way, I'm a big horse guy. I mean, historically, I don't have too much to talk about, but although my grandfather did have horses when I was a child, I remember just the majestic beauty. These animals always stuck with me. So beginning part, just some housekeeping. As I said, I've mixed all the colors here. This is a Mylar sheet. A lot of you are familiar with this thing if you follow me at all on this on YouTube. I've coated it with both a gesso, acrylic gesso, and a base color of base color of yellow ochre. So it's 2 coats of acrylic sort of prep, and then I have this light wash of a water mixable oil, Cobra's water mixable oils, which will kind of dry relatively quickly. It's a thin coat of that. Over top of that, I will be applying the alkyd oils. Let's see if we can just pull some interesting marks by doing a water spritz. I don't know if that's how you say it, but I just said it that way. So I'm going to spray some water on this base layer. In fact, this probably works better if it's larger droplets of water. And I'm going to try to see if I can pull. It didn't really work out the way that I thought, but I'm nonetheless, I don't mind it. In fact, this is what I am after. I want to have as thin a first coat as possible. So actually that's not bad. It's got some interest here. I will be working over a 2-day period, and I want to see how quickly this paint dries and whether it's worth our time. I've also done some mark making with charcoal here just to again have fun and create interest here. I'm going to try to see if I can paint this horse with as little strokes as possible. And in fact, you, as I said, have the hindsight of seeing how I finished him off, but I think, don't quote me on it, but I think what I want to do is not paint that background, as you can see in the photo, the greenery behind him and all that. I like to do a portrait of him exclusively, just him and his face, and maybe do a white background. You'll notice the color profile that I have mixed up here. They're all over the place. There's no succinct colors that I usually put out, like, you know, the traditional colors of whatever, cad red, yellows, and also so on and so forth. What I have is just some colors that I can work off of, and then again expect them to dry overnight. They will lay a foundation for me to sort of push the chroma further tomorrow, and the value structure as well. So today I want to mostly focus on the midtones. So we have shadow here. So this is all going to be in shadow. I just like the way this horse is bathed in light. I'm going to try to see, and again you probably see it already done there, but I want to try to see if I can render this guy relatively close, particularly this section here with the muzzle and the reins. I think that's what they're called. In fact, if you're a horse person, please let me know. I mean, I think this is what that's called in his muzzle. This is common work practice for me when I work with brayers, which is basically every painting. Knife in one hand, brayer in the other. Okay, so my impression right away with this paint is a -1, and that is that they're really, really gummy. Okay, so they're already kind of gumming up on me. It's difficult to explain. It's obviously not acrylic-like, but it's almost wanting to dry. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's going through that oxidation process where this alkyd medium is evaporating. Okay, so this is bathed in warm light. I want to make sure that I get this foundation correct. You know, some of you have been asking me about how to get dynamic color, and particularly the range of color. Whenever you see While I'm working on it, this is a good way to sort of explain this, but you've got this section here, which as you can see here is bathed in light, as is this part of his neck here, and to some extent this part over here. To attain that final color, that warm glow color, you've got to start with this sort of sequencing of colors. So building up of layers. In fact, a number of you asked me this. Building up of layers. So as an example, let me show you. So let's for a second assume, I don't have the color yet mixed here, but let's assume that this is the final top coat warm color. If you place it directly on top of just the base color, the effect will be that. If you place it on top of something you already built up, the effect will be entirely different. So there's a color relationship that goes on here that creates depth as well as undulations of broken color that you may not attain if you place it directly over a white surface, or even in this case where I have an underpainting. But there's always, regardless of what I'm painting, this process that takes place. Building a portrait, a horse portrait, still life, whatever that might be, there's always, generally speaking, darker, mid-tone, lighter. Man, this easel of mine is a bit wobbly. I apologize for that. I don't know, I think I need to adjust one of these legs. So even though, what I'm seeing in this photograph, even though the light's coming in quite warm, the shadow, if you adhere to that principle of warm light, cool shadow, the shadow on this particular animal is reading warm to me as well. Maybe it has to do with a lot of the reflected light coming off the ground and the trees around him. So I've mixed a warm gray for the side of his face here. That's going to be kind of jumping off point, and I think it's obviously too light, but let me get another brayer. Shadow here. Light up here. There's some reflected light here and a whole lot of light over here. One advantage of using these types of tools is that it forces you to make marks that are not too precise. I know a lot of us have this need to sort of fill in sections, and you draw in something and you don't want to mess it up by using tools like this, but the dynamics of a spontaneous painting, the kind that sort of comes up, it seems like it was painted without an effort. You have to do that. There's always pulling and pushing. Even though you put down a drawing, which I will likely do very quickly here, just to give me an idea of where anatomy is going to go. But I am never afraid to sort of break it up. Okay. What do you think? Is this starting to look like a horse? So the background, I think his muzzle is here somewhere. This is going to be that, I don't know what that's called, but I'll call it a ring. And then we've got this thing coming across. I should probably have learned what these things are called before I painted this horse today. There is something about horses. I don't know what it is. If you know, or if you have experience working with horses, let me know. They're just so combination of power and calmness and stuff. Okay, I will likely take a bit of time now to do a bit of measuring and see if I can draw some of his features in a bit more detail, just to give me some direction. I think I'm pretty close, and this is likely going to be his eye here, and his hair coming down here. Yeah, this is drawing up real weirdly, I have to admit, these colors. Okay, so I just drew down, just indicated some ideas to the placement of his harness and his eyes, just to be a bit more precise. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that I won't lose what I've kind of measured and put in here, but I just want to get a better idea as to where everything goes, and then likely I'll have to come back and draw again at some point. But for now, that I have a better idea of the head and the placement of the body, I want to indicate a bit closely the shape of that head of his. Years ago, when I first started working professionally as an artist, I used to work with organizations like Ducks Unlimited Canada, which is still pretty active today, but I used to paint a lot of, in particular, wildlife. In fact, here I'll just show you a few examples here on the screen. And the one thing that I've learned doing that process, that I kind of kept throughout my work, throughout my career, is that you can definitely overdo a painting. So what I will likely do tomorrow, when we get back to this thing, I'm almost at an end for day one. What we're likely going to do tomorrow when I get back to this is focus on one section and then work up my way across and see how much of this particular part of the painting we need to render. Okay, so we've got day one completed. I've got some observations I want to share with you here. Firstly, I'm quite content with what I've done thus far. This didn't take all that long, only an hour and a half or so. But the alkyd paints that I used are significantly faster drying than I anticipated, which again could be a good thing for you guys, or a bad thing. For me, it may be a little too fast drying, in the sense that you can't control how fast it dries. As an alternative, which I plan on doing tomorrow, is maybe using regular paint and adding my own alkyd medium, thus creating my own alkyd paints. And depending on how quickly I want it to dry, add less or more alkyd, like a liquid type medium. But just to give you an idea as to how quickly this is drying, this paint, which has been here on this Stay Wet palette for about, as I said, a couple of hours, is already kind of filming. It's in some sections, well, this is this part that I just mixed now, but it's already kind of gummy. It's flaking off. So it's drying quite quickly. And it may be that this particular paint is like that. See, this part it's almost a paste. Maybe it's this paint. Maybe if you use professional grade alkyd paint, and I know Winsor & Newton makes them, it may be different, but for the most part, I'm not even sure that I could continue working with this particular pool of colors. I'd have to scrape all this off and mix a whole lot. If I was working on a full day of painting, I'd have to probably mix, like look at this is already quite dry. I'd have to mix paint multiple times. So from practicality perspective, alkyds may be, if you're not used to them, maybe the wrong way to go. But anyway, as I said, I'm quite happy with the overall first layer here. A lot of interesting marks, a lot of interesting color. Tomorrow we're going to come in. I'm actually excited to come in with regular paint with liquid and see if we can pull out some of the features of his face, and then see how far we're going to go from there. So I will see you tomorrow. Good morning, all. We are now about, I'd say about 16 hours after this painting. The first painting session has been completed, and I can tell you that this first layer, even with some of the thicker sections here, is basically dry. It's not entirely dry. You can still probably gouge into it and remove paint, but as you see me moving this brush across the surface, nothing is really moving. It is very tacky. I don't know why it didn't come to me yesterday, but it kind of reminds me of cold wax in a weird way. It's kind of gummier than cold wax, but it has certainly set less than 24 hours later. So, as promised, I have resorted to using traditional oils and mixing a bit of liquid into them, and I will do that as I paint today, as per the need. The oils that I used is from the same manufacturer that sent me the alkyd, student grade alkyd paints, and these are more, as they call them, artist grade. Let me show you the box that they come in, and they're a set of about 10 colors. And yeah, I've had a chance to play around. This is the tube here. I've had a chance to play around with them on a different painting, and they're quite consistent, I have to admit. Pigmented and hopefully archival as they indicate. But I'll give you my full review of both of these paints at the end of this session. They're not sponsors, by the way, or in any way. All they did was send me the paints to try out, and I'm always keen on trying out new products. So today's session will hopefully get this horse to much more of a completion, and I may even speed up some of this session because it might be a little longer today, because I really want to get this head of his to much more of a realistic completion before the end of today. And as promised, I will likely use brayer a whole lot today for some dynamic, spontaneous sort of surprises, but I might pair it with a good old brush as well. So let's see how this is gonna go. Usually when I work in this fashion with a brayer in particular, I have my palette right in front of me here, which is much more of a habit for me to go down and collect paint as opposed to the right here. But some of you have been asking me about, color mixing and what colors do I use. I figured this was probably the best way to show you. So I'm working mostly in the shadow section of his face first, and then I'll use that to gauge the rest of it. I've said this before, I think a few times, but it certainly warrants repeating, and that is to remember, always keep your shadows separate from your light colors. And as you can see here, the way I'm holding this and applying this sprayer, I am obviously pulling in flat planes, but also fine lines. And I'm doing my absolute best to try to render his face, if you want, to like the utmost realism here, but obviously because the tool that I'm using, it doesn't quite allow me. That is definitely in the wrong place. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You got to keep your shadows sequestered into the shadow section. This part of the ear, at least part of it, is you got sunlight coming on it. As does the eye. So the eye is definitely gonna be the focal point here. I have a number of these brayers that I use, and they're relatively easy to clean. However, what I do is I use one for the light, or a few for the light, and certainly just one or two for the shadow. Oh, look at that white wanting to fall off the palette. That's the drawbacks of using a stand-up palette. What timing, eh? lot of light on the snout of his. I'm still kind of uncertain or undecided what to do with this background. I mean, you guys see obviously the finished painting here somewhere on the right, likely. And you know what I ultimately finished with, but I don't know here. So I'm putting in this lighter tone just to shape his head a little bit better than what it's currently. Can't forget this ear up here, and it's here somewhere. And it's definitely in the light. What would a painting be if I didn't pull out my trusty squeegee brush? I always seem to gravitate towards it when I want just the right crisp tone of color. And a lot of you have been asking me questions about what is this tool, how do you use it? They're having difficulties with the mixing. I think the one thing to keep in mind is the consistency of the paint that you're applying on it. It tends to pair well, or best I should say, with thicker paint. So straight out of the tube paint, which I'm not using here per se. I've got a little bit of liquid on here just to mimic, as I said, the alkyd paints from yesterday. But it tends to pair well with, paint straight out of the tube, or with an impasto medium, and then really just apply it just like you would with a palette knife if you have experience working with it. But yeah, it's a great tool for just getting the right color, applying that color, wiping the tool, and then maybe even go into a dark and not have cross-contamination of colors, which is a frequent problem for a lot of students. I think one of the things that I like to do quite often is pair using brushes and whatever, silicone brush or a regular brush, again with a brayer, just to break up some of the hard edges and make the whole thing maybe read as a little less formulaic. I mean, it just kind of adds this level of spontaneity that it's difficult to get with just using a brush. It's this constant process of building and then deconstructing or destroying. I've mentioned this previously in a few of my videos, but it begged repeating that when you're looking at photo references I'm almost thinking of doing another video just on this topic, but when you're looking at photo references, it's so easy to get bogged down and confused with all of the details of the photo. I've done a video on this specific to, viewing and painting planes as opposed to lines, and how masses play a vital role. This is when you look at a painting as a whole, of course, but also within the structure of the painting, there's always, juxtapositions of shapes. For example, of his jawline with his eye socket and the way that the color flows down. You've got to be able to look at masses, regardless if it's you're working off of a photo reference or somewhere in the field. And one way to do that is to squint. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this concept. If you squint at your photo, I am doing that now, even though you can't really see it, you kind of relegate your reference photo to just planes, and you get rid of all the details. I mean, it's something everyone struggles with, including me. When you look at a photo, you want to translate all those small little details from the get-go. But the point is that you don't do that. You focus on larger masses and then smaller masses as you go on. Now, none of this painting is at this point completed. I should probably have worked on his eye already as the central point of reference. But I am definitely using the squeegee and applying sort of like these small cues of color, and not focusing on, for example, the eye and all the eyelashes and all the little details. I may get to that at the end. There's a time and place for that all the way at the end. But for now, I am just looking at the big masses. And it's kind of starting to look like a horse, I think. One other thing as well that I've heard said a lot from different artists, where they proclaim that color doesn't matter. It's all about the value of the color you put down, which essentially measures the lightness and darkness of a color. I agree. However, if you're trying to get a likeness, I entirely disagree. So color, in my opinion, is one of the most vital tools we as artists have to translate our vision onto your substrate. I've done numerous videos on this, and hopefully, God willing, I'll do many more. But I treat color, it's almost like, I don't know what they call a cherry on a cake, is that what they say? Where it's just so much fun to view certain planes as just individual little small cues of color that you can approach. And in many ways, it's a lot easier than if you're just trying to blend color. But I tend to disagree with these artists when it comes to color. And I think it's quite vital. I wanted to also add that concept of squinting to reduce planes to masses as opposed to details, of course, doesn't apply for color. So for color, you've got to have your eyes wide open to assess all these little undulations of color. Speaking of color, namely the paint that I'm using, I haven't really talked much about this. We are now about, oh goodness, maybe about 4 hours into this with breaks here and there. And this paint is certainly as malleable as it was this morning when I started, which was around 6:30 a.m. here in Canada. So it certainly is much more workable. I can manipulate it by adding the alkyd medium liquid, the very well-known medium. I can certainly manipulate the paint much more so than last night's or yesterday's paint that I used for the base layer. So as mentioned, I've been at this now for a number of hours, and I think there's going to be a few more. There's no stopping. I think I like how this horse is coming out, and I want to focus a bit more on his face and this whole section here, and I'll see how far I'll push it. I may even go boldly and redo that background. I don't know as yet, but again, you probably already know because the finished painting is somewhere here on the right. And that ear needs to come in here somewhere, so I gotta make sure I get the drawing right. But as you can probably guess at this point, with regards to, this is generally as close to my style, current style that I work at as possible. So as you can tell, it involves a lot of patience. And did I mention patience? Yeah, there's a lot of that, so you gotta have that. You can't rush some of these things. I talked about drawing yesterday. I haven't really touched upon it today, but when I refer to drawing, which by the way, we haven't really explicitly gotten into on my channel. We've been about a year into this journey. I haven't done any drawing videos that deal with, well, I shouldn't say that. Last week's video on pastels was the first one, and I made a playlist that it talks about drawing, but I didn't really cover drawing as much as I covered that medium, the soft pastels. On that subject, while I have you, soft pastels. So I talked last week about soft pastels, one of my favorite drawing tools. And one of the largest or biggest limitations, irrespective of how messy they are and all of that stuff, and pigments, and people don't like working with them and so on, but the number one limitation with pastels is how expensive they are. I mean, you gotta have every color value that you need in a stick. So as you can see with this particular portrait thus far, if you look at any one of these sections, even something like this section up here, or even these, I think they're called reins. I don't know, maybe you know, let me know down below. This harness things he's got around his head, and even his cheek, there's so many different color values within the same family of colors. So this is a very warm cheek area here that has a whole lot of treatment of pinks, yellows, greens, warm blues as well. And you know, generally you wouldn't associate blues with warms, but they're warm blues, they're not cool blues. And conversely, same thing is happening on the right. I mentioned how the shadow start of his face is also relatively warm. It's reflecting off of a warm ground very likely. So there's a lot of reflected light that's coming in and warming up that shadow. So it certainly is fun to paint when you're, I don't know if I'd call myself a colorist, but I like color. Even at this stage of the painting, a lot of the face of this horse is quote unquote complete. None of it's really complete until it's the whole thing is obviously finished, but even at this stage, I am not unknown to pull a brayer and deconstruct certain things and pull certain lines and maybe introduce new ones and remove certain things. The sprayer is such a versatile tool for applying paint and removing it, of course. I'm not sure how much of the hairs of his I'm going to paint in, maybe just minimally, but I want to indicate a little bit of that mass. I definitely need to do a whole lot more work on this section right here. And that's reading incomplete to me. You know, the biggest chore, biggest task at this stage of the painting for me is how to keep things spontaneous. And of course, when do you call it quits? I might even take a knife here, maybe lay down a bit more. Stroke for that neck. And that hair comes down here. All of this is very, very warm. I didn't really get into it. For today's painting session, I kept the palette relatively simple. I mean, I generally work with the same palette, except if I'm working on something specific like a landscape, I might introduce an additional blue or two, or maybe a Payne's gray, or have certain pools of grays that I use. But for the most part, I'm working with the same palette that I even employ for my portraits. So you've got cad yellow light, yellow ochre, cad yellow medium. This is a Prussian blue, although it's reading more like a phthalo blue from this manufacturer, the one that I mentioned, Rubens colors, Rubens paints. Ivory, raw umber, ultramarine blue, and a red oxide, or some call it light red. And I have Viridian up here and titanium white. Viridian I haven't touched too much, as it's a little too cool for this particular guy. I want to make sure I get this line right. And also, there's a great deal of reflected light there. Although, in art, everything is about relationships. So that, if you look at the photo here, this is reading as a very warm reflected light against this background green. Okay, so this is part of the reason while I was mentioning, you know, I want to maybe introduce a darker background, and I've yet to decide whether I'm going to do that or not. But this is reading immensely warmer against this cooler green than it does against this light background that I have here. I don't know if it's necessary per se for the final painting. As indicated, I wanted attention to be on his face more so than anywhere else. But I'll see. Stay tuned. I think that this is going to be another, maybe a couple of hours more, and we'll get to close to completing this portrait. Even something like hair, I oftentimes just describe the form, the mass of the hair, instead of drawing individual strands. And more often than not, I use tools to describe that form best. So a brush in this case probably does a better job than a brayer or that silicone brush. I am still undecided about that background, but I will do some experimentation right now. They are in the shadow after all. Some of those values were too high key. As you can tell, this process, I already mentioned this, but it's probably worth repeating, is very time consuming. So in the end, hopefully by the end of your painting session, you can say, you know what, I put in a lot of time, which I did today. I mean, this is probably on and off 5-6 hours today of work, and I'm in the evening session now. It's almost 6 o'clock here, but I think I'm still gonna probably put in another 2 hours or so. I'm just keen on seeing both the background and some of these sections here, and then likely I will stop. I won't go all the way over here because I think the main message is right here. I still have to work on this section here. And you can imagine that if I was really recording this real time, all of these strokes, this would probably be a 3-4 hour session, video session. And as it is now, it's gonna be a little on the longer end. But if you're watching still at this point, you're very likely a diehard fan, and I want to thank you. Of course, as usual, this is somewhat second nature to me, so if I'm skipping over something or omitting something, you can always throw me down a message and I will do my utmost best to answer it. I think we are almost there. I really like the presence that he commands in that space. I've cropped, by the way, I didn't talk about the composition, but I wanted the profile to be quite cropped and thus create this much more impactful personal experience. And again, this part of the painting, as you can see in the reference photo, there's interest there. I'm not sure that it's needed, but what I think is, however, needed is a better indication of the hair that he has. So I'm going to just give it some form here, maybe not too much, just enough to sort of not have the eye wander in that direction. I'm just going to give it some form. And sometimes, as I said, this brayer is just an invaluable tool. Even at this late stage, you know, you can create interesting marks, exactly the kind that I'm after at this stage of the painting. In fact, this part, the dark part here on the right, pardon me, left, is just, you know, controlling eye flow more than anything else. I don't want it to sort of wander off the painting onto the left too much. So, and again, at the same time, it's dictating form and anatomy. For all you horse lovers, you have horses, you have history of horses, maybe you've painted horses. Let me know how I did. I'm quite happy. I don't know if I've painted a horse, and certainly not in the last decade or so. I'm quite happy with the way this came out. In fact, this was quite a long session today. This is supposed to be my day off, to be honest, but I figured, you know what, why not have some fun today? And that definitely was a whole lot of fun. Okay, I think we are at an end. I think I had a whole lot of fun with regards to this portrait. It took a little while, I have to admit, so it definitely requires a whole lot of patience. Before I forget, I want to mention this concept of having an anchor within your painting. It's just a concept that I came up with, I think, and it has to do with something that anchors the painting down from a realistic or representational perspective. In my case, this would be the highly rendered part of his face, namely the reins and the eyes and the cheek. And then everything else kind of flows off of that and is less complete, if you want. But overall, I think the painting becomes even more complete than if I finished his body here to the left and maybe the background. So this concept of an anchor, when you have an anchor, like I do with regards to a whole lot of work and detail on his face, you can kind of get away with having some of the other parts of the painting be not as complete. Now, this idea of not being complete actually is something that strengthens the composition, in my opinion, but maybe just thought I'd throw that out there for now, and then I'll likely revisit that concept in the future. I'm glad that I stuck with the overall design that I talked about initially, i.e. not rendering the body firstly, and secondly the background, keeping it light. It's much more of a silhouetted portrait. I could certainly have continued on with, again, the body and everything else and rendered all of that, but I think it's a much stronger composition like this. Let me know if you agree, of course. I'm not even sure if this particular piece is done. It's certainly done for today. It will stay in my studio. I may revisit it and change some things around, but this is supposed to be an experiment in many ways. I mean, of course, me working on a portrait of an animal, which I haven't done in a long while, but of course, the main one is experimenting with these alkyd paints. And what is my overall verdict? So firstly, the student grade paints that we used yesterday, my verdict is they are okay value, but they are too gummy for what the kind of painting that I like to do, in a way that, you know, it's somewhere in between acrylics and oil with cold wax, somewhere in that sort of realm when it comes to how quickly it dries. But overall, I think they were just a little too gummy in general. I mean, if you want to give it a go and try them out, the same ones that I have, I will link the product down below. Again, they're not a sponsor of mine. I don't get any affiliate links in case you want to try it. Or even better still, you can always try one of the professional grade alkyd paints. Or, of course, do what I did for today. and create your own alkyd formula by using any oil paint and then mixing it with an alkyd resin. Today's paints, as I said, I used same company's paints, but they're professional grade paint. And I have to admit, they're very buttery, very soft, highly pigmented as well. So that one I can certainly recommend, in particularly because of the price point. So I will link that below as well, in case you want to give them a go. I think it's available on Amazon. And one of the quirks, this is just me, or maybe it's, let me know if you deal with this as well. When you have leftover paint, I hate wasting it. So what I usually do is I scrape some of it off, the pure ones of course, and put it back in the tube. Let me show you what I mean with regards to that. This particular manufacturer has a large opening for their tubes. Let me just show you. So let me show you the difference between how this particular manufacturer, I'm not even sure you can see this, I believe you can. This is their tube, this is just a 40 ml. This is a comparable Gamblin's. It's a slightly smaller tube, but you can clearly see the openings of these two guys, the size difference. So you got the Gamblin ones, this is maybe 3 times as large. So what I'm talking about is when you got leftover paint, instead of wasting it, or maybe you can create a glaze out of this, what I usually do is just put it right back in the tube to use on the next go. It's a quirky little advantage, but I think it's a big one. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas. Hopefully it was bountiful and blessed for everybody, and happy holidays. Hopefully I'll release another video before New Year's, but if not, certainly have yourself a happy and blissful New Year's as well. I'm going to come in close and show you the marks that we completed, and of course, as usual, let me know down below what you think of the overall portrait and how it went overall.